welcome everyone to the InMotion Hosting YouTube channel. Today we're going to be doing a live presentation on website performance. Some of the tips you'll hear about will be most relevant for sites running the WordPress content management system, but a lot of the optimization principles you'll learn can be applied to many other kinds of sites as well. Before I introduce our presenter, I just wanted to briefly mention that InMotion Hosting has some Black Friday, Cyber Monday deals going on. So in the description, there'll be a link where you can check that out. And I'll go ahead and introduce our presenter, Stephen Ayers. I've known Stephen for years. He's a WordPress developer. He's been developing websites since he was 11 years old. He's given a lot of talks about WordPress security and optimization at our local WordPress meetup and at WordCamps over the years, which have been very helpful to the WordPress community. So I asked if he'd be willing to share some of that with us today, and he agreed. So here's Stephen Ayers, everybody.
All right, thanks, Chris. Thanks for the intro. Yes, I've known Chris for quite some time. A lot of people ask about performance, website performance, mainly because as it ties into SEO and things, and as you especially on mobile devices, it becomes a more and more important type of thing. So let me get on into sharing my screen here, and I'll show you a little bit more. So when I think about performance, I can't help but think about a Ferrari. It's kind of the universal, like, I want my website to be the Ferrari. Now, WordPress out of the box, it's not a Ferrari, especially when you add you start making it do what you want it to do. But in the words of the famous philosopher Ricky Bobby, I want to go fast, and we want your website to go fast too, because it affects everything. So, but what is page speed? It's how quickly your website can load for the visitor, which could be a potential buyer, measured in seconds, of course. And, but who cares? Who cares how long it takes to load your website? Well, it affects your conversion rate. And what a conversion rate is when someone comes to your website, if you're selling something or you're trying to build an audience, like add them to a newsletter or whatnot, the percentage of people that come there, let's say 2%. So out of 100 people, 2 people end up buying something. Well, that affects your revenue. Also, loading fast means they're going to stay on the site longer. Maybe they won't bounce. They won't just be like, oh, this is too slow, and leave. So it's a better user experience. And of course, as mentioned before, Google tends to favor websites that load quicker. Because, bottom line is it actually costs Google less money to crawl your website. And I'm not talking about specifically your website, but websites on a massive scale, hundreds of millions of websites that it is constantly crawling. So when it runs across a site that's quicker, it's provided an incentive for people to make their websites faster so that they rank better, and it saves Google money on the crawl portion. So there's a benefit there. And of course, if your website's smaller, it's cheaper to host. Maybe not for a small site that doesn't get a lot of traffic, but these large sites, they cost a lot more money to host, especially when we get into thousands and millions of visitors per day or per month. So these things start to come into play. And so I found this case study a couple years ago, and I tried to find it online today, and I think they've taken it down, and that's unfortunate. But I found a case study that talked about the 30 days of mobile traffic for an online retailer. And the study showed that 30 days of the site's mobile performance data, comprising of 4.5 million mobile user sessions. The sessions are plotted on a graph that shows distribution according to load time. Here's that graph. So basically, what you're looking at here is on the left is the number of sessions, and then on the bottom we've got load time. So as traffic increased, everything started loading slower. But what was important about this is you notice that at 2.4 seconds, you see that there's a 1.9% conversion rate. Now, these lower load times, I'm not really worried about them because they're really low on the conversion rate. And that's because, a page that doesn't have much of any content loads a lot quicker. But pages that have substantial content are going to take more time to load. But as you notice, the longer it took for the page to load, the worse the conversion rate became, because people basically said, this is taking too long, I'm going to leave. And so that is a clear distinction that your load time is affecting your money. Now, here we've got the bounce rate, like I said a second ago. Of course, pages that don't really have much of any content, people will get there and go, there's nothing here, I'm going to leave. That's why there's high bounce rates on these that loaded really fast. But when you get down to content that was substantial, actual real content, it took about almost 2.5 seconds to load. But any pages that took longer than that, you should notice the bounce rate starts increasing tremendously. Now, 12.8% bounce rate is really good. And what that means is out of 100 people, 12, almost 13 people left immediately. They didn't look at anything. They just left. If that page took a lot longer to load, more people would have just immediately left. It's kind of like walking into a store, looking around and going, this store is taking too long to figure out what's going on. I'm just going to leave. I'm in the wrong place. So, having a really high bounce rate is really going to hurt your conversion rates, which inevitably hurts your money, your revenue. Now, if your website doesn't make revenue, maybe, it doesn't matter. But at some point, if you want to be able to have a website long-term, you're going to have some type of revenue involved, whether that's ads, whether that's converting into an audience, building an audience, or selling something, etc. Now, as a general rule, I like to keep a bounce rate below 33%. So having a 12.8% bounce rate is phenomenal. That's a fantastic bounce rate. So whoever built this website was doing a great job of getting a bounce rate that low. That's phenomenal. So let's look at, it's one thing to see someone else's case study. I like to look at something that relates to me. This is actually some stats from a website that I built years ago or rebuilt. So we had a 2.11 conversion rate for this website, which is actually really well. I mean, this site was very tuned. It was a marketing firm that was managing this, but the site needed some work. It wasn't mobile compatible. It had problems. So we did a little tuning work right here on this green line here, and we made it more intuitive, easier to read, and more concise. And as a result, we got the actual conversion rate up to 2.44%, which is a pretty big, substantial increase. It doesn't seem like much, but that actually turns into thousands of dollars in a short period. Later on, we rolled out an update, an actual full redesign, which is this orange bar right here, which made the overall website faster. There was more call to action verbiage. It was more mobile friendly. It wasn't just speed related, but as a result, we ended up having a 2.34%. Now, that's not as high as this 2.44, but keep in mind, this is over a longer period of time. So, which accounts for different times of the year has, higher or lower conversion rates. But overall, one of the biggest impacts was mobile compatibility, and that mobile part ties into speed because mobile phones they're slower to load a website than a desktop because oftentimes you might be in an area where you don't have fast internet. So making your website load quickly helps the mobile users. That's why it was so important for this mobile friendly and speed to be tied in. So this benefited the client very well. And as a result, they were able to retain that client for several years. I think they still do even today. So this is taking it from just concept of, we should make our website faster because it's better, to actually we did it and here's what happened. And now they continue to make more money and benefit from that long term. So I like to think of the internet kind of like water going through a hose, or often referred to as bandwidth. So if your website is the water and the internet is the hose, and you're trying to get the water from the server to the user, well, the more kinks you got in that hose, the slower the water is going to come out. And the way to increase that flow to get your website to the user faster is to either, one, get rid of the kinks, or two, add more horsepower to the what's serving the website, like hosting and so forth. So, or all the above. Now, one of the things that makes it more difficult is if your website has a ton of plugins. Now, I can't believe it. This is crazy image, but it very, greatly illustrates how difficult it is when you've got a ton of bricks on your bicycle trying to go down the road. Imagine having a website that's got 50, 60, 70 plugins. That sounds crazy, but I've seen it. And those websites take longer to load. So, the fewer plugins that you have involved in your website, the easier it is for it to load for the user, and the smaller amount of water you're trying to pass through that garden hose. So what's a quick cheat sheet to, like, what can I do, actionable things I can do to actually make my website faster? Well, first thing is, as mentioned before, use fewer plugins. This is easier said than done. Use 20 or less plugins. If you're not a developer, it may be difficult for you to achieve this. So sometimes you may have to deal with a larger amount of plugins until you're able to get enough revenue for your website to hire a developer. But you could also implement some other things to compensate for that. So fewer plugins is ideal, but sometimes you may not have an option for that. You could make your website smaller. Use SVGs for your logo. Try to use. You could even use, for your images, compress them. So tinypng.com is a great website for doing this. It's free. They also have a plugin you can install that will do it right from the website. I think it's a freemium type of plugin. So if you start getting into a lot of images, you may end up needing to buy a premium subscription or so. Also, you could build your own icons. So if you're using like JPEGs for icons, then you're slowing down your website. You could actually use Fontello to build your own fonts. A lot of people use Font Awesome, which is another great thing, but Fontello actually uses Font Awesome and a few other different libraries like Font Awesome to get exactly what you want. So fonts are, able to scale as big as you want and as small as you want and it always maintaining a crisp, clean look. That's why it's preferred that, if you're going to use icons, try to use an actual font library to do it. And also consolidate and compress your code, CSS, JavaScript, and HTML. Now, you do not have to have a web developer like myself to actually accomplish this. And I'll show you how to do that in just a few moments. And you can defer JavaScript files. Also, there's ways to do this without having a developer involved, using a plugin. And you can use the third-party CDN. Now, CDNs basically hold all your graphics somewhere else. And the way a CDN works is, if I'm in Tennessee and I'm trying to look at your website might actually be hosted in Texas. Well, if you're using a CDN, maybe there's an actual server that has a copy of all your images in Tennessee that can serve me the files that are physically closer, which means it takes less time to get to me, which means your website as a whole will load quicker. So that's the benefits of a CDN. Usually I try to stay away from CDNs for my purposes, but if you're heavy on graphics, you probably need a CDN, and especially if you're doing catering to an international audience, you're probably going to want a CDN as well. And use Nginx. Usually the CDNs are running on Nginx. These days, and Nginx is your web server. So these days, a lot of your managed hosting companies or services, they're all running Nginx. So talk to your host about that. The chances are they're probably already using it, but if they're not, you can request it. So, and you won't have to touch it. Let them take care of it. Also, load heavy third-party scripts such as ads on a 3-second delay. If you're a news site or you have a site that actually has revenue from ads that are displayed, put a delay on your ads so that Google will actually scan your site and say, "Oh, your website loads quick. You're gonna get benefits of the SEO, right?" And they're not going to penalize you for all these ads that are running, because these ads are heavy. They usually have a lot of they're making a lot of requests to a lot of different servers, and that takes a lot of time, so which slows down your website. Also, use an SSL. These days, this is pretty standard, so you don't have to worry about that. It pretty much is set up by default these days. But if you're not using an SSL, use an SSL. It operates on a HTTP2 protocol, which allows the data to go quicker on the request. And if your website's been around for a while, you might be running an old version of PHP. Now, WordPress, as of today, is still compatible with some older versions of PHP. So you probably haven't thought, "Oh, I should upgrade my PHP version." If you do, you could see some major gains, especially if you're going from like PHP 5.6 to 8. There's a massive increase in performance there. And so that would be a big thing that you could do. And all you'd have to do is contact your host and let them take care of it. So also, PHP gets cached by Opcache. So depending on how you're caching your site, you may not see the differences initially. It depends on your site, so be aware of that. Better security. Here's something to think about. If your website's constantly getting, basically brute force logins and all this garbage traffic keeps hitting your website, well, that means that your website's too busy trying to load itself for this garbage traffic, and your real customers are not, are getting your website and loading it, but it's slow because the resources of the server are getting bogged down, right? So a way to kind of avoid this issue is to have better security, not just necessarily on your website itself, but actually at the hosting level. Quality hosting makes a big difference because they'll block a lot of that traffic. Using a service like Cloudflare, for example, will also help block a lot of that garbage traffic so that you're not trying to serve a website to, a bot or to, someone that's just trying to brute force log into your website, those type of things. And also, as mentioned before, upgrade your hosting. If you're making money from your website, you should just upgrade your hosting to have a better quality experience for your users. If you're able to serve your website faster, you're going to make more money. It'll pay for itself in the long run. How much should you buy as far as hosting is concerned? Look at your traffic, look at what your needs are, talk to your hosting company, and they'll kind of guide you on what is appropriate for your situation, because not every solution is a one-fits-all type of solution. So we talked about minimizing and aggregating CSS and JavaScript, and also deferring JavaScript. There's a great plugin called Auto Optimize. And what it does is, and it's free, it's completely free. You can go, here's a link to it. You can go to the WordPress repository and download it. And when you install it, there's a lot of, you can search on YouTube. There's a lot of tutorials on how to tune with Auto Optimize. I'd just go to YouTube and look for those. But this plugin will aggregate all your CSS. So instead of loading 10 or 12 or more CSS files, you'll load one, because it'll create a single file that's minimized, and it'll reference that and take out all the other references. It'll do the same thing for your JavaScript. It'll also defer your JavaScript if you want it to. It's a very, very helpful tool. I use it on every single website that I have. Another way to, one other thing that I like to do is implement caching. Now, depending on your hosting, you may want to talk to your host. You may already have a caching plugin provided by your hosting. It depends. If you don't, you can use a plugin called W3 Total Cache. It's been around for a very long time. You can upgrade it if you want more support. There's also WP Super Cache. And if you're running Lightspeed server, you can use Lightspeed Cache. There is a premium plugin that I've used as well. It's really well done, is WP Rocket. And WP Rocket will actually do some of the aggregation of CSS and the JavaScript stuff that AutoOptimize does. I think W3 Total Cache does it as well. I'm not sure about Super Cache or Lightspeed because I've not used either one of those in a very long time. So, but those are some things that you should check out if you want to be able to get some immediate and very quick performance gains with very little effort and without having to talk to a developer to do it. So, and Chris, did you have any questions about from the crowd about plugins? Usually this is an area where people do.
Actually, we had a question from Julio who asked, it's not directly related to plugins, but he says, hello, what about having a lot of PDF files on your site? Is that similar to images where you might consider a CDN? I guess, would you be curious how often those are downloaded?
That's a good question. So PDFs, of course, you can't really, I mean, I guess you could. You're typically not going to embed a PDF. So usually you'll link to it and someone will download it. And yes, a CDN would benefit, you would benefit from a CDN in that aspect. One of the things that you can do to, especially with PDFs, is load a PDF into, I think like an Adobe Acrobat, or there's several PDF tools out there that can compress them to make them smaller. Because oftentimes they're, PDF is, you never know who made it or how it was made. It may be 300 DPI meant for print, like print quality, when in reality, if they're just wanting to read it and it's on the web and you're not trying to like actually print a magazine, then you could compress it and it end up being a lot smaller. I've seen PDFs that were like 20 meg, and actually when you get done compressing it, it's 500K. So it depends on the PDF. But I would certainly implement a CDN for something like that, especially if you've got a lot of them. And also your big files, I would go through the PDFs and actually try to compress them using several tools out there. And do a Google search and see best ways to compress a PDF. I'm sure there's tons of options out there that I'm not even aware
of. Excellent. Sounds good. Yeah, that was the only question so far. So yeah, we can proceed.
All right. So how do you know how fast your website's actually performing? Well, there's a lot of different tools out there. These are primarily the main tools that I have continued to use from time to time when I do speed work. Of course, PageSpeed Insights is Google's own tool, Google PageSpeed. And I usually use this last. I should have put it last. The tool that I use first is usually GTmetrix. And GTmetrix, and I'll demo that in just a moment, GTmetrix will scan your site and give you a score. And the score is arbitrary, but it's a measurement. And then it'll say, it took this long to load the site, and here's some things you can do to improve it. And then I will proceed to make adjustments to the website, maybe making some files smaller or doing some lazy loading or those type of things. And then I'll keep retesting with GTmetrix. Once I get a good score with GTmetrix, I then will go to Pingdom and test it on there and see if there's any other things that, maybe GTmetrix wasn't picking up. And then when I'm done with that, I'll go to PageSpeed Insights and see what Google says about it. And so, because they all kind of look at it similarly, but they all tend to have a different perspective on PageSpeed. But at the end of the day, your PageSpeed and Google PageSpeed Insights is the one that really matters, because that's from Google. If you're worried about SEO, so without further ado, let's do some demos. I am going to go to GTmetrix here. And can you see the screen, Chris?
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay, so I tried actually doing weather.com because weather.com is notoriously slow to load on even a desktop. But it was so slow that GTmetrix wouldn't even scan it. So I had to settle for CNN. And so I scanned CNN, and you can tell that, GTmetrix didn't look favorably upon their website. And what you obviously want to see here is like a green score of A, preferably 100% or, above a 90. And they kind of grade you in different ways. And if you go, well, 2.1 seconds, is that good? Is that bad? You can hover over these little question marks and it will give you more context. So, and it explains I won't go into detail about all these little things, but it'll give you context and explain them for you. And they've even got links to other resources about it, which is very helpful. You want to see this to be as quick as possible. You want to see all these numbers, you want to see them to be very low. This one, cumulative layout shift, what that is how much time was spent on moving the items around on the page as the CSS was loaded, or as maybe an ad was loaded, or content was shifted upon load, because maybe it's loading in certain spots here and there, and then it moves everything around. Well, that causes the layout to shift. So that's what they're talking about. But this tool is great because it gives you a little screenshot here, gives you a score. It shows this little timeline right here of how long it took to load. You can see right here, it took 57.1 seconds to load this site. Wow, that is ridiculously long. I like to get my website fully loaded under 3 seconds. That seems pretty ambitious, for a news site. News site's a whole different animal. I think you'd probably be thrilled to have it under 10 seconds. It just depends. But they're also saying here that, first contentful paint is 1.2 seconds, which is not bad. You'd probably want it to be that maybe under a second. And then largest contentful paint, 2.1 seconds. That's not great. But you can go down through here and look and see. It'll give you some suggestions on, things that are having the biggest impacts and how to see right here, use the content. So this is a website that would heavily benefit from using a CDN if they're not already. You can go into long detail about this. What's nice is you can expand this and it'll tell you what aspects of this loading process is bogging you down. And to see a better, I like to usually, this is just the summary. I like to go straight to the waterfall and look at what is loading. And so if I scroll down here, there were 775 requests to serve this website. And part of that is a lot of ads. But you can see it's also 4 megabytes, which is pretty large. And that's compressed. And it took 57 seconds to load. That's crazy. I don't even know what to think about that. And apparently, let's see, I thought they were using CDN, but they're not. But there's so much things going on here. CNN, yeah, they are using a CDN right here, cdn.cnn.com. I imagine they're compensating for their slow website by throwing more server resources at it, which is an expensive way to solve a speed issue. But I don't doubt that that's exactly what they're doing and still have, this horrible score. So what they could do in this scenario is some simple things. We talked about CSS. Let's click on the CSS. So they are doing some CSS. There's not a whole lot of CSS requests on here, so that's pretty good. I'd stop referencing Google Fonts and I would make that local. And I would put that, and I don't even know what that is. That looks like I would try to put all my CSS locally instead of referencing another website. All these are other domain names, which that takes a It has to do a DNS lookup, which takes more time, and that's, time is money. If you look at JavaScript, let's see how many JavaScript files. They have a ton of JavaScript files. Now, anything that's CNN.com is already on the website, which means they could have combined all of these things into a single JavaScript file. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I mean, there are quite a few that are already local to their server, but they could go a step further and make a good portion of these local. Some of them are probably attached to advertisements, so they wouldn't be able to touch those, but that's going to happen. So, but the more that they're able to tune and make this website faster, because they're so large, it would save them a tremendous amount of money in hosting, and they would have a better experience for their viewership. So it's a double gain. So I'm surprised, but I'm not surprised. It's a news site. They typically don't think about performance, website performance, but I'm surprised that they don't, because of the double impact or even the multi wins that they would get from doing it. So I like to look at those things. Let's look at images, and then we'll go to, and then I'll show you an example of a website that is actually doing well. So with images, you've got a lot of images here, but I like to go to the top and click on this little size so I can actually sort by size. So they don't have any huge images on here. That's good. They are using a CDN, and it looks like they've compressed them. So that's good. But I do see that they're using a favicon here. Okay, you can't get rid of that. So without spending a lot of time on this, it'd be hard to diagnose that they have so many things going on. It looks like this is their ads. So some of these things are actually ads. I'd say a lot of them are. I would have probably lazy loaded them, but it's difficult to convince advertising department to agree to that, because that's, there's a trade-off there. And then here's a 403 error. So I'm not sure what's going on there, but one thing you'll notice is if you've got, when you're looking at this waterfall, if you start to see the status code, this is 200, which means they found it and it served it successfully. If you start seeing like 400 errors, like right here, failed, whatever, for whatever reason. Now it could be that they're blocking this actual scanner, but it could be that it's actually failing, and you won't know until you actually go there. So if we go to CNN.com, you can see there's a lot of things going on here. And of course, ads galore. It won't even let me look at the, let's see if it'll let me look at the, yeah, of course, another ad. It's still loading. So again, it's 52 seconds to load it, almost a minute to fully load this website. Of course, I am able to see some things, but it's so slow, it's not even letting me right click. It won't even let me. That's funny. So, that's the downside to having a very heavy website, is you're going to run into multiple problems. I'm never surprised when I actually start looking at a waterfall that we discover actual broken parts of a website, and you go, oh shoot, we didn't even know our website was broken. So those are some benefits to looking at this stuff. Because you would, who goes and looks through this and says, oh, we've got 3 references here that are broken. You wouldn't know. Let's try to, here we go. We got a 404. So this one's straight up a 404. So this is they've got an analytics, contextual analytics. That could be an ad, who knows? But that's a 404, and which not found. And then the 403 is an unauthorized access. So which might be because of the scanner itself. Let's go ahead and go to the top and look at a different site. Let's look at InMotion's site. InMotion actually has a pretty good score here. They've got an A score. Let's see. Their fully loaded time. I don't know what they're using. Do you happen to know, Chris, if they're using WordPress for their main site?
Our knowledge base, our support center, and blog are definitely on WordPress. I'm not actually sure about the homepage.
Gotcha.
It
Well,
might be developed in PHP by hand or using a framework.
right. It might be a framework. Who knows? I could look through it, but we're not going to do that. But you can see they've got 5.6 seconds. That's not bad. I'd rather want to see that under 3. So when I look at something like this, I go, I want to see that under 3 seconds. I want to see time to interact. I'd love to see that within 1 second. And I know.
Carrie says that IMH is a custom Symfony site. So there you
Okay.
go.
Okay, so they're using custom Symfony, but since they're doing custom, they can't take advantage of some of these plugins we just mentioned and so forth. But they do have a little bit more control over what they can do. So let's see what GTmetrix says about it. GTmetrix says serve static assets with more efficiently cache policy. Now, keep in mind, you do have to take some of these things with a grain of salt, because it is a tool, and tools can sometimes give you false positives, and then you go, well, no, that's not right, or whatever. You kind of use it as a generic checklist, and because it'll bring things to mind that you weren't aware of. But sometimes you also go, no, that's not right. We can't do anything about that. We're going to ignore that. So do keep in mind that this is a guide, not the law. So, and you can expand through here and see what it's actually dinging you for. And it never fails that GTmetrix dings you for Google Tag Manager. And especially like Hotjar. When you start using some of these third-party scripts, there's nothing you can do about it. You can't not reference the third-party script. So those are some things you're going to have to live with. And that's just how it goes. So be aware of that. But overall, and then here's a great, if you click on the performance, it'll actually give you kind of a summary of, all your stats as far as seconds. Time to interact, I don't know what they consider good. Look, so they're saying 2.5 seconds or less. So I like to look at 1 second, but it also depends on how complicated your site is, which also affects how, like some sites, this might be as good as you can get it because you've got a complicated site. InMotion's actually got quite a bit of things going on here. They've even got this live chat going on. So it's not just a simple site. And even despite they've got a pretty large image here, they've got a pretty good score. Let's look at structure. Serve static assets. So for the most part, they're doing pretty well. I'm sure that they probably spend time on this stuff because it matters. Now look, you're right here. So 85 requests. On a typical WordPress site, I try to get this below 30. I also try to keep the size of the site below 3 meg, ideally below a meg. It's kind of like the rule of threes. Try to keep it below 30 requests, below 3 meg, and fully loaded under 3 seconds, on load around a second. And this is kind of almost there on the fully loaded. Again, it always depends. Do we have any websites anyone would like to take a look at, so to analyze and give some advice on for anybody that's watching?
I picked out a few in case nobody has one, but yes, if you do have a website you'd like Stephen to analyze in real time, you can put it in the chat. Of course, I'll review it beforehand if it's anything not safe for work. But if I'll wait and see if anybody has one they'd like us to look at. I pulled up a few. I thought maybe Adobe.com, popular site. So I'm curious how they do.
CNN is still loading. You see that?
Wow.
It's still loading. I wanted to kill it.
Do you think that's just because their front page is maybe it's too dynamic? There's too much going on at once.
It's the advertising. It always is the advertising. Keep in mind, the advertising what will happen is the advertising will load as soon as your website loads. That's why I say delay it. You want your content to load first, and then let the advertisement load, so that the advertisement's not loading before your content loads. And of course, your marketing department might disagree with me on that, because it's, we want to serve the ads. The ads is revenue based. But if you're not able to serve your content to the user and they're just seeing ads right off the bat, they're probably not going to be too happy about that, and they might leave. So you got to find a balance there. But even after an ad loads, after 20 or 30 seconds, it's going to refresh the ad and load again and load again. And so basically, if you got let's see, that's an in-house ad. I don't think GTmetrix has any actual ads on its site that are third party, but yeah, so it'll just keep loading more and more ads into infinity. One thing that will hurt your computer's performance is if you have a lot of tabs open that have web pages in those tabs that have ads, because they're constantly loading ads. So if you're like, man, my computer's really slow, close down the 30 tabs you have open, because you might have some that are loading ads continuously and really bogging your computer down. But you said Adobe, if we don't have any other.
Sure, yeah. And Carrie, she makes an interesting point here. She says in Google Tag Manager, you can use afterload to cascade the loading of various marketing scripts.
That's a good point.
You're familiar with?
I don't know how that would play out because I've never done it. But that makes sense. I know that Google Tag Manager has a lot more fancy tools than I've used. Google Tag Manager is one of those things where you set it and then you forget it. And, because if it works, why fix it if it's not broken? So usually whoever sets up the Google Tag Manager, they'll do it and then they won't touch it for a year or two, hopefully, because you shouldn't be really swapping scripts out a lot. But if you're the larger your website is and bigger your audience is, you might be doing more things like Hotjar and testing, A/B testing. So there might be a little bit more touching those things. But yeah, there are ways to tune that a little bit better in Google. I prefer to, if you can get away with it, is to the fewer third-party scripts that you can get away with, the better. And Google Tag Manager, I try to avoid it if I can, but there are scenarios where you need other people to have access and to be able to manage your third party, and thus you can't avoid using Google Tag Manager. So it just depends. Adobe.
A quick question I had, if it turns into a long question, maybe we can defer it, but I was wondering, imagine if someone, like say they have a popular blog and they're paying for hosting and they want to introduce ads to maybe to help with the costs of hosting. Is there an ideal way of doing it strategically so that you don't introduce too many ads that slow down the site, because then you might have to pay for more hosting or pay a developer? Is there a happy medium where you can, like, for somebody who's making that step?
I will say that adding advertisements to your website will not cause you to need more hosting, because keep in mind the ads are being loaded from a different server, not your server. So your ads themselves are not going to cause you, unless you're serving ads directly from your server. But more than likely you're using, a third party, unless you're an advertising company, but you're likely using, like Google, AdSense to display ads, or you're using another agency that, fulfills that inventory. That's not going to affect you on whether you need more things. Now, will it bog down the load of your website? Of course. And you adding more server resources on your end is not going to change that. It's not going to change how fast you load, because the bottleneck is not your server. It's the user. It's the user's browser and the user's connection to the internet is the bottleneck, because you're trying to load all these ads. So I've learned that, you'll go to some websites and there's just tons and tons of ads, like CNN. But in reality, your ads are not effective if there's more than 3 ads in view at all times. So if you're on a page and you see more than 3 ads at a time, the advertiser's not going to get a quality, leads from their advertising. So if they will eventually stop advertising on your website, or they will not be willing to pay a lot of money to be there. So you got to think, if you want a quality experience for your visitor, but you also want to cater to the advertiser as well. I've found that happy medium is no more than 3 ads. I like to have no more than 3 ads on a page, period. But in reality, you may want to just no more than 3 ads visible, or 2 ads visible at all times. It just depends. I don't want my website being bogged down because of ads. And I do have a website that has advertising, and I've had to deal with this type of thing. And that's, it's something you have to kind of try it out, see if this works, see if that works. And page speed optimization is always trial and error. So be aware of that. Let's look at, did we have a website that we wanted to test?
Nothing yet.
Let's try Adobe and
yeah.
see what GTmetrix says about Adobe. And also, let's also do PageSpeed Insights. Adobe, I expect to, wow, that was quick on Google's end. It failed. It didn't even, computing the web core values 20-day period. It just straight up failed. Interesting. Huh. That's interesting. Let's try. CNN.com. Always go to the website first and then copy the URL, just so that I'm not copying a URL that's being redirected. Just a little tip. Try analyzing that. Well, these websites are so slow that that it looks like Google's not loading them. Now, Adobe did load decent. It got a B. Let's see, what was their total? And they fully loaded in 6.9 seconds. I wonder why PageSpeed Insights is not giving anything. Huh. Interesting. Let's try my website. Let's see. Oops. Hot in there. Oh, I guess it's just diagnosing performance issues was still going. It was just taking a long time to go. Okay, here's an example of what you want to see. You want to see these are kind of numbers green across the board, basically. And so my accessibility needs a little work, but my performance is good. My best practices in SEO. Now this is for mobile. If I go to desktop, this is what it gets. And this is similar to what you see in GTmetrix. This tool is a lot more strict than what you'll see on GTmetrix. Let's go back to using Adobe and see what we get with Adobe's. Seemed like that was taking a lot longer for Adobe. So it's doing this down here. I don't know what this Core Web Vitals assessment is. Google's constantly changing this tool, so it changes a lot. I've seen probably 5 or 6 different versions of this tool over the years. It's still loading. We'll see what it, we'll go back to it in a minute and see if it's got anything. So I highly doubt that Adobe is using, it won't let me right click. I think that's because we're in a video share. It won't let me right click. But I highly doubt Adobe's using WordPress. But you can see right here, they've got an excessive DOM size, and that's the document object model. So there's a lot of elements in their website, which is no surprise. Adobe's pretty heavy with, I mean, anything they build is really fancy, and usually fancy comes with a lot of weight. So avoid chaining critical requests. So they're doing some things that, let's see. See, they got a lot of JavaScript right here. They could combine. You can see that right here. Let's go to their waterfall, and let's look at their JavaScript. So right here, wow, they have 23 JavaScript files. Imagine the speed gain they would get if they would just take that down to 1. And they may not be able to take it down to 1 because they've got, looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They're not all Adobe domained, but you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 right here. I don't know what these are. This looks like probably another CDN. So there's a couple things going on here, but they could probably reduce this easily by 10 and get a gain out of that. Now keep in mind, you can tell by how quickly this is loading, 67 milliseconds to load this file. That's pretty fast. So they've got a lot of horsepower behind this server. I mean, the server that they're using to serve this, and it's probably not a server, it's probably several servers load balanced. So they've got a lot of horsepower pushing this out to be able to load that fast. Of course, that's probably Adobe DTM. That's probably a CDN. 6 milliseconds. That's phenomenal. But they're paying a lot of money for that. They could save themselves a lot of money. They've got the money, but they could save themselves a lot of money if they were to optimize this. But this is, it's companies like this that would really benefit from optimizing their website for better speed. So that's just something to think about. Let's look at their CSS. So there's not a lot of CSS going on here, but they are using Typekit, but they are using 3 different CSS files that they could combine here. Are they all on the same domain? They are. So yeah, they could combine these 3, and you go, well, hey, why does that matter? We served it in 7 milliseconds, we served it in 2 milliseconds, and we served this one in 2 milliseconds. Who cares? It's already fast. It doesn't matter. It does matter, even though this saving 2, like right here, if this was still 7 milliseconds and we saved 2 milliseconds here and 2 milliseconds there, it would still matter because it can actually allow the overall waterfall to continue to move forward because you don't have 2 items blocking the next process, if that makes sense. Because you can typically only do so many processes simultaneously from your server. There is a limit. Of course, they've got a lot of horsepower behind this, so it's not going to it's not going to be as drastic of a felt change. And you can tell right here that these, they see the big gaps right here, but this is 18 milliseconds, but there was a huge delay here. And that's because you're loading something that is from a different domain name, which means that they had to do a DNS lookup. One thing that you can do too to increase, especially for a site like this, is try to load all of your local stuff, like Adobe stuff, first. Load it soon. And then let all your third-party stuff, like Typekit and these other domain names, load them afterwards and make them asynchronous so that they're not waiting on the thing before it to load. So those are some things you can do. Of course, consolidating your CSS and your JavaScript would reduce the actual load on the Adobe server. And overall, they may not have to pay for as much horsepower that they're paying for to deliver this website. So there's a lot of things going on here. How I would approach this website is much different than how I would necessarily approach a WordPress smaller site. It just depends. You want to go with the things that are going to have the biggest impact, the quickest, and there becomes a point of this is good enough. Maybe if you don't have a budget to do speed, maybe you implement some caching with Redis, or preferably Redis. Redis is really fast. You can talk to your host about that. You can use some of these WordPress plugins that I mentioned earlier that can take advantage of your caching and also consolidating your CSS and your JavaScript. Those things are going to have the biggest impact very, immediately, as well as optimizing your size of the images that are actually on the site using a tool like TinyPNG. So beyond that, the more advanced stuff, you're only going to, it's kind of like you've got a 90 score and trying to get to 100. You can get to like an 85 or a 90 score within 20, 30 minutes. And then getting to closer to 100 may take you 20 hours. So at some point you got to say this is good enough. But especially for your use case, the bigger your website is and the bigger your organization is, the more you can justify spending 20 or even 50 hours optimizing your system, because it saves you a lot of, it benefits you in revenue, but it also saves you in cost. So there's double gain there. So it may make more sense for a large organization more so than, say, a smaller organization.
And you mentioned WordPress there again. Julio had another question about recommendations for Joomla. Are a lot of dynamic content generators or content management systems similar, like reducing plugins, reducing the requests, consolidating the JavaScript and CSS files? Is it a lot of similar advice?
Absolutely. Obviously, I'm partial to WordPress. I've been working on WordPress for quite some time. I used to be a Joomla developer. I haven't used Joomla in a very long time. I'd say over 10 years. It's changed a lot, and I can't give much advice in Joomla, but the advice is the same. Adobe's not using WordPress or Joomla, but their issues are, they need to consolidate their JavaScript. How you go about it may be different. Obviously, you're not going to be able to install the plugins that I've mentioned previously in a Joomla setup, but there are solutions out there that would cater to your scenario for Joomla. And that goes for any system that you're using. Now, of course, you start getting into the more custom your setup is, like this Adobe site is probably very custom, then the solutions are going to have to be custom to accomplish what I'm recommending. So that's the beauty of WordPress, is there's already tools out there that have made everything very convenient. In a WordPress setup, I can take a site that's loading terribly and get it to a B or even an A very easily in a 30-minute time frame, just because of these plugins that already exist. So, you got to determine, even when choosing, well, should I use WordPress or should I use Joomla? You got to use what makes sense for what you're doing. For Adobe, it probably doesn't make sense to use WordPress. That's why they're using, they've got big, pockets. They can implement whatever they want, and someone made a decision to do it this way, whatever that way is, because that's what makes sense for them. If Joomla makes sense for you, use Joomla. If WordPress makes sense for you, use WordPress. For me, most of the time, WordPress makes the most sense. Not always, but most of the time it does. So,
Yeah, I do hear people sometimes saying that like PHP is old school, and there's a lot of popular static CMSs like Hugo and Jekyll, and you can have a bunch of markdown files. You generate a plain HTML site locally, and you just throw it up to your server, and it's just plain HTML, so it loads instantly, even on cheaper hosting. What are some of the pros and cons of that for a small site versus something like WordPress that's dynamic?
well, if you're able to do that, and it makes sense for you time wise, then do that. The big benefit is, in that case, I can't speak for any of the tools that you mentioned because I haven't used them, but I can say that when you've got a static site, it does load faster. But keep in mind, when you've got, like right here, let's go back to InMotion example, because it's a WordPress site, and I want to compare a WordPress site. Well, it's not a
The main
WordPress
page
site.
is on
Sorry.
Symfony, but InMotion/support is on WordPress. If you can do
Let's do that.
sub URLs.
InMotion.com/support. So let's do that. So we're actually looking at a WordPress install here, and it'll take a second for that. But with any site, a static site doesn't have to be compiled. Like PHP is compiled in the moment, unless you're using caching, but it still has to eventually, it has to get compiled initially. And when it is compiled initially, there's a delay. Okay. And usually it's in milliseconds, anywhere from 300 to 600 milliseconds, depending on your server, right? Well, see, look, they got a really good score on GTmetrix for their support side of things. So let's look at their waterfall. And right here, you can see to actually serve this site, it took 176 milliseconds. That's not bad. But part of this time that's being spent is actually processing PHP. And if they're using caching, which I imagine they are, because they know what they're doing, they're able to get this to be a lot smaller. So usually, if they weren't caching, this would probably be closer to 300 or 600 milliseconds. So this is likely a cached scenario. So you don't, when you're doing static hosting and you're just delivering the HTML, that's equivalent to a scenario where cache is being sent to the browser, to the user, which is equivalent to this moment. So is there a benefit? Yeah, you don't have to have as many complicated things involved, but I can accomplish the same thing with a WordPress setup by implementing Redis caching. So, and with a WordPress setup, I can grow as big as I want or not. And I have a lot more flexibility. So it really just depends on what you are comfortable doing and how much time do you want to spend in it. There's more maintenance to a WordPress site than using one of those static servers, services. So, you know, it really depends. If you're going to have I would say if you're going to have a website that's less than 10 pages and it's purely just some static content, okay, use a static site. But if you really want to grow an audience and get your website to rank well, you're probably going to want to end up in a WordPress environment because WordPress has a lot of tools like you've got these SEO plugins like Rank Math and Yoast and so forth. And those type of things, you're going to leverage their hard work and their programming code into your website where you can take advantage of making your website more SEO friendly instead of you having to try to do that with the static setup. Now, maybe the service already does that for you. I don't know. But with a WordPress, you're able to extend it to cater to your needs. And when your needs change, you can change your website to cater to your needs again. The static scenario may not be able to grow with you. It depends. Like I said, your hosting as well as what you're using to serve your website, as far as the software side of things, whether it's WordPress, whether it's Joomla, whether it's a static setup, it all depends on what you're trying to accomplish and and not just where you are today, but where you're going in the future. And I try to stay with WordPress as much as possible, but there's certainly scenarios where I'm like, WordPress is too much overhead for what I'm doing. If I've got a tiny, simple site that's never really going to change, I'd set up a static site in a heartbeat because I don't want to have to deal with, oh, I got to go do plugin updates or I got to go do a theme update and all those things. I'd put up a static site in a heartbeat for something like that. So does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah. There's you always have to investigate your individual situation. Yeah. I guess I'd also add WordPress makes managing multiple users really easy, like back-end users.
Right. WordPress comes with a lot of functionality right out of the gate that is really hard to match. Now, Joomla does too, because Joomla is a content management system, just like WordPress is. Now, when you start getting into other services that are going to, and again, this all heavily depends on how comfortable you are and tech savvy you are for doing a lot of these things. If you're not very tech savvy, then you're going to go, well, am I savvy enough to do WordPress? There's a lot of tutorials out there for WordPress. Am I savvy enough to do Joomla? There's not as many tutorials to help you out, but there are a lot for Joomla as well. When you start getting into static things, if there's not a service out there that's going to hold your hand the whole way, you may have to rely on your own skills to accomplish that, getting into things like NPM package manager and building your own thing. And if that's your thing, that's cool. But if you don't have those skills, you probably want to go gravitate towards something that's going to give a little bit more support for you. So like I said, it really depends.
Excellent. Well, so I don't see unless we had anyone else that wanted to have their site analyzed.
Let's look at this Adobe on PageSpeed Insights real quick. Yeah. It's finally loaded. So like I said, GTmetrix, I like to get the score up to an A, and I'm surprised they're giving it an A. Maybe I'm surprised this is in motion. I'm still surprised they're giving it an A since it's an 88. I thought an A was a 90. They've changed this tool over the years, so things change as time goes on. But if we go back, let's see if they can, here's Adobe. So Adobe's at a B. They must be doing it on the structure. So Adobe's got a B. That's not terrible. And they've got 6.9 seconds on their fully loaded. But when we go to PageSpeed Insights, they just get hammered by PageSpeed Insights. That's why I say do GTmetrix first. If you're happy with your GTmetrix score, then go to PageSpeed Insights, and then reality sets in, and you go, oh, this isn't as good as I thought it was. Because with PageSpeed Insights, there's two things. There's a mobile score, and then there's a desktop score. So the desktop score is not that great. And so I try to get, usually by the time you've gotten this up to an A, once you move over to PageSpeed Insights, it's not an A. It's usually not that well. And then I start going by their checklist, and they do a pretty good checklist as well. So here they show that, oh, you're loading a bunch of JavaScript files that you're not using. And look, Google Tag Manager. So, and that's another thing with Google Tag Manager is you're probably loading all those resources, those third-party scripts and things. You're loading them on a page that doesn't necessarily need them. So, that's something you have to deal with, that you have less control over when you're using Google Tag Manager. Or maybe you do, you just got to know how to do it in Google Tag Manager. And I'm not the person to talk to about that because I don't use it. But you can see here, Google PageSpeed Insights is going to give you suggestions on how to fix these things. And, a lot of these things are not extremely difficult. You can see right here, resources are blocking first paint of your page. Consider delivering critical JavaScript and CSS inline and defer all non-critical JavaScript styles. Learn more. Google's does a really good job of educating you on how to fix these things. Keep in mind, Google benefits from your website loading faster. So this is a mutual benefit situation. Google wants you to have a website that loads faster because that means it can crawl your website faster, which means it takes less of Google's resources to accomplish that, which saves them money. So as a whole, if you make your website faster and a lot more people make their website faster, Google benefits. Their overall overhead goes down. So they do a very good job of helping educate you and telling you what this stuff means. You can see right here. So, but I like to use GTmetrix first. And then once I think I've done about as much as I can do, I'll go here and see if there's anything that I can do. Some of these things you're not going to be able to do anything about. And you'll bump into those things, but you may find some things that you go, oh, we're loading some JavaScript files that we don't even use anymore. I wouldn't have known that through the GTmetrix, but I'll see it here, and obviously make sure you're talking to someone that knows what they're talking about. So if you start removing files, maybe it's not being used on this page, but maybe it's used on another page, which is where I would say, well, then don't load it on your homepage. Load it on the pages where you need it. Don't just entirely delete it. Load it when you need it. So, but that's just, these are things that you wouldn't know that are even happening until you use these tools. And so it's like taking a drink out of a fire hose. There's a fire hydrant. I mean, it'll blow you, it'll take you down. There's so much information here. And I think you can spend an entire week trying to optimize your website if you really wanted to. The more complicated your website, the longer it's going to take you to do speed work. That's why I say, at what point is good enough? And so usually for the average site, it's going to be implementing some caching, maybe upgrading your hosting if need be. I try to put hosting upgrade kind of as the last thing that I do. I'll do as much as I can do first, see what kind of gains I get, because maybe it'll save me money from having to need to actually upgrade my hosting. I wait and do my hosting upgrade last. I see what kind of impact I can have with the speed work. And then at that point I go, I'm going to have to spend a lot more time or a lot more money hiring somebody to do this to really get any more benefit out of my speed. And I don't think it's worth it. It'd be easier for me at this point. I either accept what I've got or let's upgrade to better hosting, which means maybe I put it on a faster hosting, and your host will tell you what'll help you and what won't. So
Yeah, Kerry mentioned that about W3 Total Cache actually does let you customize which scripts and plugins load from page to page. So
okay,
interesting
yeah.
feature.
Keep in mind that with a lot of those things, like W3 Total Cache is a very, very complicated plugin. And it's not complicated because they did a bad job or anything. It's complicated because it does a lot of things. It's a great plugin, but you've really got to spend some time and understand. One, you got to know what you're looking at before you just turn it on and start flipping features. You don't want to go in there and be like, yeah, I want that, and turn that on and turn that on. Like, woo, are you going to break your website? When you're doing speed work, try, if at all possible, create a staging site for your website. If it's a small site and you don't get a lot of traffic, maybe you don't care, but to do it on your live site. But I prefer that, my website as often as possible while it is online, that it works. So if I'm doing speed work, I do it on a demo site or a staging site, so that, because you might break it. And so oftentimes turn on caching, turn on one thing at a time, save it, refresh the page, click around. Does everything work? All right, let's turn on the CSS. We're going to combine all of our CSS. We're going to turn that on, save it, go to the home page. Does everything work? I'd even open up your developer tools to see if you got any problems, and I'm trying to think of, it's not going to let me do it. For some reason, my browser is not letting me open up developer tools, but usually you can right click and inspect element, but I think because I'm in this screen share, it's not letting me. But you want to turn things on one at a time as you tweak these things, because if you break something, you want to know that it's the last thing that you just turned on is what broke something, and then figure out, well, why did it break? Or maybe you just, for this site, you can't do that particular thing. So that's why doing some of these things takes time. And of course, always test your website. Just because you're like, oh, this is great, I put this plugin on, I turned on caching, I consolidated my CSS, my JavaScript, and I compressed a bunch of images, and it looks great, loads fast according to GTmetrix. But you need to actually go to your website and browse the website and make sure it still works. Not just while you're logged in, open up an incognito window and test it, because it may work when you're logged in, but not work when you're not logged in. So when you're logged in, usually it's not serving you cached versions of your website. It's when you're not logged in when it does. So that's something to be aware of as well.
Yeah, and staging site, that's something that's very important that maybe a lot of people don't take advantage of. Preferably in an environment that is one-to-one, or even maybe the same server as your website. Like I've seen some people have a staging site on a subdomain,
Right.
but just have something in place where that subdomain is not being crawled.
Right. Oh, absolutely. And one thing to emphasize what you just said, not being crawled, make sure that your website is marked as no index for the staging site. You do not want Google crawling your staging site and then getting confused. Well, which site is the real site? And then they end up penalizing you for duplicate content, because you got a copy of your live site on a staging subdomain called staging dot whatever your website is, and you're getting dinged for duplicate content because you've cloned yourself. So you don't want that scenario to happen and accidentally shoot yourself in the foot.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's I've covered a lot of things here, but it's you certainly do not want to go into trying to do this type of work quickly, especially if you're not experienced. If this is the first time you've ever even heard about speed work, learn a little bit and take your time when you're implementing some of these plugins. Or talk to your host and say, hey, do I need a caching plugin? Because they might already have one installed specifically for your hosting and you don't need that. But maybe you do need something that consolidates your CSS and your JavaScript, or maybe there's settings that you just aren't aware of that are not turned on for, for your host. So talk to your host is probably one of the, if you're not very familiar with what your host is providing you, talk to them first to make sure that you don't go in and break some stuff because you just didn't know. So,
and a combination of talking to your host and trying things out. You said 20 to 24 hours of speed work over the years or over a sustained period of time is quite normal.
well, usually, how much time you talking about how much time you spend doing speed work?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't think I mentioned explicitly, but I did some speed work and, on, like, for example, just as an example, my own website, it's a basic website. I don't really have a lot of things going on it, but it's a WordPress site. And I did speed work, I don't know, like 3 years ago. And I spent a lot of time doing speed work on it specifically as an example for other people when I say, hey, here's an example of what your website should look like. And, and even I tested it the other day. I haven't done any speed work on it in 3 years and it's going pretty well. It's got content on it, but it's not doing a whole lot of things, but it's still out of the box. Without the speed work, it would not be scoring this well. So if you do spend the time to implement things that make your website faster, you benefit from them for quite some time. However, if your organization is constantly changing your website, not just the content, but changing features of your website, redesigning the website. Every time you redesign the website, you need to reevaluate your speed issue because you probably implemented a bunch of performance issues. So because I haven't changed the design of my website in over 3 years and I haven't really modified anything, my speed has, the only thing that's changed is the tools that we are using to measure it. And it has fluctuated a little bit because this used to be a perfect score, but it doesn't matter. These scores are arbitrary. However, it is important that you reevaluate probably annually. Hey, let's go ahead and check our score on GTmetrix, or let's check our score on PageSpeed Insights and see what it is once a year. Stick it on your calendar as a reminder. You can go into GTmetrix and they have monitors here, which are kind of cool. And I don't know. Okay, so you have to upgrade to use some of these things. So if you are serious about speed and you've got a lot of websites, you could pay for a subscription with like GTmetrix, and it'll monitor your speed performance. And I think it'll even send you reports via email. So those are some things you can do. You can use Google Webmaster Tools. And it's not called Webmaster Tools anymore. What's it called? I think it's Search Console is what it's called now. You can tell I've been doing this for a while. It hasn't been called Webmaster Tools in a long time. But Google has an area in Search Console that'll tell you, your speed. But it tends to kind of not be that helpful. Unless you've got a really big site that gets a lot of traffic, then it might be kind of helpful. But for the most part, using PageSpeed Insights and using GTmetrix or even Pingdom is going to give you a better idea of what's actually going on. And so how much time do you spend? Back to your question, depends on the site. I could probably get away with 30 minutes to an hour on a typical site just by using these plugins and some small tweaks. Bigger site that's more complicated could be 10 hours, could be a whole week. It just depends. But how often do you need to spend that kind of time on it? You only need to spend it when you've done major changes to your site. That's when. Once you put in all the hard work and you haven't changed the structure of your site, you'll benefit from those performance tweaks for a while until you do really a redesign or anything like that.
So it'd be good to go through and have it like a checklist or something at any time you make significant changes on the site. Have a good strategy for what you want to go through and routinely check.
Right. And the quickest thing to do is just run it through GTmetrix. Run it through GTmetrix and run it through. I mean, that's the first. If you come to me and you say, "Hey, Stephen, can you look at my website?" The first thing I'm going to do is load the website and go, "Okay, well, now I know what it looks like, but I'm going to run it through GTmetrix and I'm going to run it through PageSpeed Insights and see what kind of score it gets." And then at that point, I'm just highlighting what GTmetrix is telling you. I mean, all the information is here. They I mean, this essentially kind of becomes your Bible. You're going to reference this, a lot and make changes to your site. Make sure you clear your cache before you run another scan, because otherwise nothing's going to change. But then you retest it up here on the right. You just retest it and then see what kind of score you get now. And then you're going to end up hitting this test probably 30 times, especially as you're making changes. But it can be a time-consuming thing. But like I said, most people, you install a caching plugin, you toggle a few settings like auto optimize, you turn on a few settings, and then you save it, clear your cache, retest it, and boom, you've made a huge stride. Now your website's loading tremendously faster, and for the most part, that's usually good enough. If you're relying on your website to really make money, and every 100 milliseconds is money, then you're going to go, okay, it makes sense for us to dump 20 hours or 30 hours into making this thing run like a Ferrari, because it's going to affect our conversion rates. It's going to affect our revenue. So it depends. And that's how I would determine whether it makes business sense to invest that type of resources into speed. Is what are we going to get out of it monetarily?
Yeah, absolutely. And about requests on the site and consolidating CSS and JavaScript, I know like a lot of people, like if they want to bring in like Bootstrap or like a CSS framework, you have an option of including the link to their CDN or integrating that into your own CSS. Which one do you think would be better?
Well, I'm not a fan of using someone else's library. That's a great question, by the way. Using someone else's library on another server. First of all, if their server goes down, then my website's broken. And the fact that they've got a CDN, the chances of it going down, or your website's probably going to go down before their website goes down. So, however, you can see right here, when this first request is made to serve the homepage here, it has to do a DNS lookup for adobe.com. Well, the next adobe.com request, there's not another DNS lookup because it's already been done. So it can just immediately serve the file. Well, when it's a different domain altogether, there has to be a DNS lookup, and that takes a little bit of time. Now, they're obviously using a lot of resources here to serve on other servers. Like Typekit's got a lot of horsepower behind their website, so they're serving this really quick. So it depends. How fast is your server? If you've got a really fast server, even though this is only 69 milliseconds, etc., you could just save the number of requests that you're doing by having those resources local. However, with Typekit, I think it goes against their, I've used Typekit before for certain sites, and it goes against their user, I think against their terms of use to make that stuff local, because they measure your usage. So you wouldn't have that option for Typekit, but you may have that option for other things. Ultimately, the fewer number of requests that's involved, the faster your website's going to be overall. And I want to show you this one. Let's see. Here's a good example. Oh, so I got a good score on GTmetrix and this is a WordPress site. This is fully loaded in 514 milliseconds, and this is a WordPress site. It's kind of a basic site. You can see a little screenshot right here. But right here on my waterfall, I have 11 requests. And I could actually make that fewer. I could get rid of these 4 guys right here. And you can see that it looks like it's big, but that's only 175 milliseconds. This is 175 milliseconds is how quickly my server is able to respond and serve it, right? That's serving the HTML with some PHP compiling, or it's serving from cache, probably cache because it's 175 milliseconds. It's pretty quick. But as you can see, there's even room for me to make this faster. So there's Google Analytics. I am using Google Tag Manager. I think they're doing that because of this script here. That's interesting. But right there, I'm using Auto Optimize. You can see that right there. And I'm using Auto Optimize again, but I should be able to figure out how to combine those two. So there's some room for improvement on this site, even though I haven't touched it in a long time.
But for anyone who recently joined, you talked about Auto Optimize during your presentation toward the beginning of the stream. It's a WordPress plugin that defers JavaScript and CSS for you.
Right. And what that does, WordPress, if you go to wordpress.org and go to, let's see, you go to plugins and search for Auto Optimize. I mean, this is a very popular plugin. It's got over 1 million people using it. And let's see, did I pass it? Usually there's like screenshots, but they don't have any. But yes, you can get in, you can install this. I would bet you that there's Auto Optimize settings. Let's just look at that. So if you go into Auto Optimize, here's a one. Now that's Kinsta telling you how to do it. There's all kinds of tutorial videos. Here's one tutorial video on how to optimize Auto Optimize. So I would find a tutorial video. I don't know if InMotion has one on it or not, but there's lots of information out there that can help you tweak these settings. And I'd certainly go there to do that.
If we don't have a video, then I think we'll get on to making one pretty soon.
Yeah, obviously it's a very popular plugin. For me, I manage my own servers, and I, through just my own VPS, and I don't have a lot of these plugins to handle my caching. It's all done manually. But I do use Auto Optimize to handle now Auto Optimize. What I haven't looked at it in a while, because once you set this stuff, you kind of go, oh, don't touch it. But last time I checked, Auto Optimize did not deal with caching. It purely dealt with JavaScript consolidation and minification, and it'll create a cache of that file and a cache of the CSS doing the same type of thing. But it doesn't get into like Redis caching and Memcache and all that stuff. So. But yeah, I would check out one of these videos for a good tutorial. And I want to say, let's see. So right here, you see this little green right here? Earlier I was talking about DNS lookups. Right here, this portion of the timeline is just to look up the domain name. So just to look up googletagmanager.com took up 13 milliseconds, because Google's got a lot of horsepower behind theirs. To look up my domain name, it took 42 milliseconds. Now that doesn't sound like a lot, but when you have when you're serving your content from a lot of different places, that adds up. So, that's why I say the fewer requests involved and the fewer domains involved to serve your website, the leaner and the easier and the faster it is to serve it to your visitor. And of course, your score will be better too. So that's kind of the overall gist of it.
Yeah, that's a very important message to drive home, I think, because if you just install a site and you install WordPress and if you come to one of our meetups and you install plugins and you do all kinds of things, if you
Absolutely.
don't know how many DNS calls are going out,
And
using the
and
name.
every time you install a plugin, you're literally hiring another developer that you've never met. And I'm not saying don't do that. I'd certainly do that, but you don't want to just install a bunch of plugins. Oh, and also leave a bunch of plugins installed that you don't use. So if you go, this plugin's not for me, well, disable it and uninstall it and stop using it. You'd be surprised how many websites I've ran across that they're like, hey, my website's got problems and I don't know what's going on and it's slow. Can you fix that? I go in and look at it and it's like, well, are you using this plugin? They go, I don't know what that is. And come to find out, they're not even using it. So I take it out. And then, this plugin was causing problems with another plugin because they have a ton of different plugins installed and half of them they weren't even using. So to keep your housekeeping, basically, to keep it, I don't remember why I installed a particular plugin way back in the day when I built whatever website or built my own website even. There's actually a great tool for that, keeping comments on why you installed a plugin. I wish I knew the name of it right off the top of my head, but so the fewer plugins you have involved in your website, the less likely you're going to have problems, not just functionality problems, but maintenance problems. It's less to maintain. It's also going to make your website faster because it's less to load. So all these things affect each other. So if you can get by with fewer plugins, that's definitely the way to go. I think I have on this particular site, I think I've got about 8 plugins for this site because most of it's custom. So,
and some people, if there's and I don't know if you'd recommend this or not, if a plugin has a very simple functionality that you could literally copy and paste into your one of your template files.
yeah, like in your theme functions.php.
Yeah.
Depends. It depends. First of all, are you comfortable touching code? Rule number 1. So if you're not comfortable and know what you're doing, at least on a fundamental level, then you probably shouldn't do that. 2, if that plugin functionality ever becomes incompatible with your latest version of WordPress, well, are you keeping up with that? If you as a developer, I know I'm not. Like if I copied some code that I know works and then I stuck it in my functions.php file for my theme because I have a custom theme, right? Or I've got a child theme of a not so custom theme. If I've done that, well, I'm not keeping up with, is this still compatible? Well, it may stop working at some point on the next upgrade of WordPress and I'm not aware of it. And then eventually someone's going to tell me about it, or I'm going to discover it, on a Friday evening right before I stop working. And I'm going, oh no, I've got to fix this problem before I call it a day. And then I work a lot longer on a Friday. So, you got to weigh your pros and cons. Sometimes it makes more sense to just use a plugin and let someone else shoulder that burden. However, if you know that there's a plugin that has this functionality and there's another plugin that you want to use that has some other functionality as well as that functionality, then get rid of the one plugin and use the plugin that's got both, that has more of, multiple things. It's taking care of multiple needs instead of just a single need. So there's a little bit of a growing pain there. You can't just willy-nilly just install a plugin and then just go, okay, I'll never delete that. We're going to use it forever. And then, sometimes some of these plugins overlap in functionality is what I'm saying. So, so be careful when you're trying to weed out and say, oh, I don't need this. Well, do you? Are you sure? Are you the person that put it in there from the get-go? Sometimes I've broken my own site because I removed things I didn't think I needed and come to find out I did. There is a plugin out there, and I don't know what it's called, but Chris, you may want to search for it and link to it later. And it gives you the ability to do, I think it might be called plugin comments or something. But it gives you the ability to comment on why you installed the plugin to begin with, which is huge help.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. Let me let's see. Let's find that real quick if you got a second.
Yeah.
It's a great little plugin and it's pretty simple.
because I would say even if you just have like people keep notes related to their website, or at least they
Right.
should, like hosting, and you may have an encrypted password database, like wherever you keep information about your site, if you could log what you're doing, it's gonna be really helpful.
Oh man, I cannot think of what that plugin is called. Let me see if I can find it real quick in another window, because I know I'm using it on one of my sites and it is super helpful. Let's see. It is Plugin Notes Plus is what it's called. Plugin Notes Plus. This is the plugin. It's not that popular of a plugin, surprisingly, but it is super awesome. And what it does, you can see a screenshot right here. When you're in your plugins area, so let's say you installed Akismet, add a note right here and say, hey, this is why I installed it. Don't delete it. It's used here on this page of blah, blah, blah. You know, you may need to put a note in here that says, and you can mark whether it's critical or not critical or whatever. You can say, do not update this plugin. It tends to break, that kind of thing. And then that's one of the reasons we installed it for one of the sites that I maintain, was because one of the plugins that we use likes to break on updates. And so we put a note here. This plugin is vulnerable to breaking on an upgrade. So make sure you test on a staging site before you just upgrade it. You know, things like that. But this is a fantastic plugin. I don't know the developer, but kudos, my hats off to him, because I certainly use it. Who is the developer?
Great idea.
Jamie Bergen. I don't know who that is, but whoever he is or she, awesome plugin.
Excellent, excellent. Now, I had another question. I'm not sure if it would be more of an SEO or an optimization or both, but
Sure.
I don't know if we already addressed redirects. Like I was once working on a site where I thought I'll just use the post query string for the post ID, so that way if I ever change URLs, I won't have to update a bunch of internal links. But limiting redirects is something you might want to think about. Is that right?
Right. And so, and what you're actually referring to is how many redirects are involved in the process of getting to your website. And a good example of that is, let's talk about, we'll do InMotionHosting.com. This is Wheregoes is a website that helps track the route of redirects. This is actually my website. But if you trace this, so you'll notice that it should be redirected from here to the HTTPS version, as well as the www subdomain version. And kudos on InMotion for not having an extra redirect involved here, because usually most sites will redirect to the HTTPS version and then have another redirect that redirects it to the correct subdomain version, because this was using the naked domain. So if there's a lot of redirects involved in getting to your website, then what will happen is it slows down the process. And you can see that right here. So I'm going to copy this URL. And if I go up here to GTmetrix and I actually trace this link right here, which is the one that's going to get redirected, it'll reflect in the waterfall the redirect that's involved. And of course, if there's like multiple redirects involved, it slows down your ability to deliver that content. So obviously you want to get rid of those redirects, if at all possible, altogether. Don't link to this version of the URL, link to the actual final destination. You know, for SEO, Google said that, they say it doesn't matter on redirects, for backlinks, whether it hurts you or not. I think it does, but that's my opinion. SEO is mostly opinion. And unless you can back it up with some data, and then that data is very dated. But as you can see right here, this is a different score altogether. Look, this is a worse score. It's 75. Let's go to the waterfall. Right here, you can see there's a redirect involved. This was the URL initially. You got a 301 status. That ate up 155 milliseconds in addition to what it would normally serve. So yes, the redirect slowed down the loading of this page.
So just the redirect alone literally dropped us from an A to a B.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah. So yeah, that it matters. Well, and I don't know what the score was for InMotion host. I don't know if you had an A or a B on this before, but yes. And one of the suggestions that it'll give you is avoid multiple page redirects. Boom, right there. Potential saving of 676 milliseconds. Interesting. Well, what redirects is it talking about? Well, it's talking about, this is the redirect that we introduced, but apparently there's another redirect involved some here. And I wonder why that one, there's no redirect there. I don't know why it's listing that. Like I said, these tools are a guide, not the law. So you kind of have to take it with treat it as such, But obviously, it did negatively affect the load. And if you've got a backlink, so where this comes into SEO as far as that goes, if someone is linking to InMotion, they're linking to this URL on a website, well, Google hits that, crawls it, and then detects that there's a redirect involved, and you might not get all the influence from whoever linked to you because there's redirects involved. Google, I don't remember exactly, but Google said a while back that that's not going to negatively affect you. They used to say it did. Now they say it doesn't. I tend to err on the side of, if you're going to have backlinks, you want them to go directly to where you want them to go with as few redirects involved as possible. That's just good housekeeping. And I can't imagine that Google would not penalize you on that, because back to what I originally said, the longer it takes to load your website, the more money it costs Google to crawl it. So I cannot fathom that a redirect would not be punished. So just from that, perspective, the fewer redirects involved, the better for all parties involved.
Absolutely.
All right.
Right. Yeah. So I think, so unless you had any other critical points, or if anybody had any other questions, I definitely appreciate you taking the time to sit down and walk us through the basics. I would definitely refer people back to the cheat sheet in your slides from before, which I love. I think it's really helpful. And yeah, again, being with us.
Well, I think you said that this was going to be recorded. So
Yeah. It'll exist on our YouTube channel after the broadcast.
Well, that way they'll be able to pause it and look at it. Because I don't have a link for this particular presentation. So.
Oh yeah, that's fine. All right, so great. Then, well, thanks, Stephen. I guess I'll cut off the broadcast there.
All right.
And thanks for joining us. And if anyone else has any other comments down the road, feel free to drop them below. And thanks again.
All right. Thanks, Chris.
See ya.